Twilight Zone.
And now, Mr. Serling.
I'm about to show you a picture of something that isn't what it looks like. Pleasant little town, it isn't this at all. It's a nightmare. It's a chilling, frightening journey of one man into a mystifying unknown. You're invited to join that man in a most unique experience. Next week, Earl Holliman asks, and you'll ask with him, where is everybody? Here's an item we forgot. A moment for the people who pay the tab. It's often said that a picture is worth 1,000 words. Case in point. Before we meet again, try Oasis. You'll know what I mean. Next week, I'll have a reunion with a unique talent and a valued friend. Our first since Requiem for a Heavyweight. Next week on the Twilight Zone, Mr. Ed Wynn stars in One for the Angels, playing an old pitchman who sells mechanical toys like this, but whose competition is Mr. Death. We hope you'll join us then. Thank you and good night.
And now, Mr. Serling.
Next week, we invite you to take a walk down a western frontier street at the elbow of a doomed gunman whose salvation lies in nothing less than a magic potion and a Colt 45. Mr. Dan Duryea stars in Mr. Denton on Doomsday, next week on the Twilight Zone. We hope you'll be able to be with us. Thank you and good night.
And now, Mr. Serling.
This motion picture projector and this film provide a background to next week's story when a most distinguished actress takes a journey into the Twilight Zone. Miss Ida Lupino stars in the 16mm Shrine, a haunting story of a haunted woman that I think you'll find interesting and perhaps shocking. We hope you'll join us then. Thank you and good night.
And now, Mr. Serling.
Next week, we invite you to take a strange journey back in time with Mr. Gig Young, who tries to make the exodus of all men in their desperate attempt to relive the past. We offer a most bizarre story called Walking Distance, and we hope you'll be around to share it with us. Thank you and good night.
And now, Mr. Serling.
An excursion into fantasy on the Twilight Zone next week as two distinguished actors, Mr. David Wayne and Mr. Thomas Gomez, appear in Escape Clause, the story of a strange contract between a mortal man and his most satanic majesty, a contract that ends most surprisingly. We hope you'll be around to see what that surprise is. Thank you and good night.
And now, Mr. Serling.
One of next week's stars is alongside me now. She'll appear in a most unusual tale called The Lonely. It's a story that takes place on an
asteroid, and it's a most intriguing premise.
It sounds it. Next week on the Twilight Zone, Jack Warden, John Daner, and Jean Marsh appear in a bizarre tale of a man and a woman. I don't understand it either. Thank you and good night.
And now, Mr. Serling.
Next week, a distinguished actor lends us his talents, as Mr. Burgess Meredith stars in Time Enough at Last, the story of a man who seeks salvation in the rubble of a ruined world. We hope you'll share this very strange experience with us. Thank you, and good night.
And now, Mr. Serling.
Once upon a time, there was a ship sailing from Liverpool, England to New York. It never got there, and one man on board knew why. Next week, we tell this man's story. The distinguished actor Nehemiah Persoff plays the role of Karl Lancer, a haunted man in a haunting story called Judgment Night. This ship sails next week, and we hope you'll see it off. Thank you, and good night.
And now, Mr. Serling.
Next week, three men return from a flight into space, only to discover that their nightmare has just begun. Rod Taylor, James Hutton, and Charles Aidman appear in And When the Sky Was Opened. What happens to these men once they're picked up in the desert? Well, that gives you a rough idea. You'll see next week on the Twilight Zone. Thank you and good night.
And now, Mr. Serling.
This is the season of gift giving. Big gifts and little gifts and expensive ones and not so expensive ones. Well, next time, the Twilight Zone gives you its own peculiar, oddball brand of gift-giving. Mr. Steve Cochran and Mr. Ernest Truex combine talents to tell a story about a little man who has what you need. Our next offering on the Twilight Zone.
And now, Mr. Serling.
Next week on the Twilight Zone, one of the most bizarre and unusual tales we've told yet. One man with 4 faces. 4 separate and adventuresome lives that must be seen to be believed. Harry Towns, Philip Pine, Ross Martin, and Don Gordon star in The 4 of Us Are Dying. This is a story designed for goosebumps. I hope we'll see you next week. Good night.
And now, Mr. Serling.
Next week, we'll give you a lesson in astronomy, but the kind of lesson not taught in schools. Fritz Weaver, Edward Andrews, and Joe Moross appear in Third from the Sun. This is a story that takes place on the eve of doomsday. We hope you'll join us on the Twilight Zone. Thank you, and good night.
And now, Mr. Serling.
There's a Longfellow poem. I shot an arrow into the air, it fell to earth, I know not where. In our story next week, we shoot a spaceship into the air, and where it fell, only you and I will know. Starring will be Mr. Dewey Martin, Mr. Edward Benz. Next week, we promise you a most exciting journey into space. Don't miss the takeoff. Thank you and good night.
And now, Mr. Serling.
Next week, you'll drive with Miss Inger Stevens, who starts out on what begins as a vacation and ends as a desperate flight. She begins her trip next week on the Twilight Zone. And you'll be with her when she meets the hitchhiker. We hope you'll be alongside. Good night.
And now, Mr. Serling.
Species of machine known variously as slot machine or one-armed bandit. If you've ever played with one of these things for a while, you've probably gotten a peculiar feeling that this is a machine with a mind and will of its own. This is precisely what happens when Everett Sloan contacts a fatal ailment we call the fever. You'll be an eyewitness to it next week on the Twilight Zone.
And now, Mr. Serling.
This is the model of a Newport, fighter aircraft, vintage World War I. Next week, it's flown on a patrol over France in 1917, and its pilot discovers that time has passed him by. Kenneth Haig stars next week in Richard Matheson's exciting story of the last flight on the Twilight Zone. We hope you'll join us. Thank you, and good night.